Hey, hi there. Top 5 podcast for beginners. For beginners. If you are a beginner, this is for you. Now, if you say that, sir, I don't understand a podcast, the speed is fast, the accent is different, words are difficult for me to understand, then this video is for you. Don't miss this video. In this video, I'm going to tell you which are the top 5 podcasts for beginners. And if you want to speak fluently and confidently, this video is for you. Don't miss it. The list of podcasts which is there in front of me, this podcast, I have listened personally myself when I was a beginner myself. After that, now, before recording this video, I again listened to these podcasts and then I realized exactly these 5 podcasts are best for you. Let us start here. First of all, understand your fluency, your confidence, your communication will never develop if you do not listen a podcast. No, grammar is not going to help you. Already have said many times. What you need is to listen. But to listen, most important thing, what to listen? Which podcast to listen? The first and most important criteria is you should be able to understand that podcast. Otherwise, you are just listening to sounds and it's of no use. Your mind will be diverted, distracted, no concentration, and you are just physically listening, but something else is going on at the back of your mind. So this is the first thing, is you should be able to understand. Second, it should be very interesting, otherwise your mind will divert. The topic, the content of the podcast must interest you. Otherwise, come on, like for example, if you love cricket and just imagine you are listening to cricket podcast. How do you feel? Like, wow, what's going on? Because I'm interested in the content. But if you're listening to a podcast, psychology podcast, which I love, you will hate it. Your mind will be distracted and your language sentence formation will not happen there. Therefore, first thing is the podcast should be understandable, the English level, and second is it should be interesting. Now, here is the first podcast which I believe that, which is very simple, but as I said before, when listening a podcast, the interest is very important. The topic is very important, and I have some 4 or 5 topics which will definitely be interest for you because these are connected with self-improvement. One more thing I want to say: do not listen to any podcast where they teach you how to speak in English, where they teach you the sentences, where they teach you the grammar. No, language will form unconsciously if you focus on understanding and enjoying the podcast. But if you try and learn English consciously by listening those podcasts I have come across, it's of no use. You will be confused because if someone is teaching you how to speak a language consciously, will not be able to speak. You become conscious, and consciously no one speaks. Right now I'm not speaking consciously, I'm just speaking unconsciously. Got it? So the first podcast is think fast, think smart, communication techniques. This podcast is really nice. Very simple English, American accent, but don't worry, very simple to understand. You will understand, you will enjoy. Go and try this podcast. And in this podcast, this is a Stanford podcast, and they will talk about communication skills. How not only, as I said before, keep English aside, enjoy listening to the podcast. So they will talk about some of the best techniques, psychological techniques to overcome your fear, nervousness, anxiety about communication. Worth podcast. Now, the second podcast I think is again very, very important is 7 good minutes. We don't have that lot of time to listen to a podcast, but this 7 good minutes is an amazing podcast. Just try this. And I have listened to this podcast. Some great techniques he shares to develop your habits, to the mindset, the strategies, everything is there. And many of my students have told me after listening to this podcast that they really enjoyed this podcast. So you can just go and try I'm not saying all podcasts, 5 podcasts you should listen to, but out of these 5, choose anyone which you like, which you feel comfortable with. Everyone has a different taste, so go with this. 7 good minutes. Third podcast is there, a bit of optimism. Now this is my favorite podcast because this guy, Simon Sinek, I love him. He's a great communicator. Plus, I hope you know his books, Start With Why and He Does It Last and all. So the people who come here, the guests who come here, they are really great, who have achieved a lot in their life. They will tell the strategies, their failures, the plans, the depression they have gone through. So this podcast will really lift your spirit. And if you are really down in the dumps and feeling depressed and bored, go with this podcast. Okay, fourth in my list is my podcast. Now, even while adding this name in this list, I was feeling like what they will think about me, like he's promoting his own podcast. But not like that. I really believe that my podcast is really good. And this podcast I specially started for you people. Because I don't know, in India, how many English podcasts are there? Very few are there. And another thing is they are not consistently uploading the podcast. Every Sunday, 7 p.m., you will listen to my podcast. And my podcast is, as I said before, do not listen to English speaking podcast. Listen to a podcast which really means you. The topic really attracts you. I mean, you are passionate. You worry about that topic. You care for the topic, And here I cover all psychology, fear, anxiety, also communication topics. So this is my 5th podcast. Last is Mel Robbins. Do you remember Mel Robbins, the 5-second rule author? Her podcast is really nice. In her podcast, guests come, she also speaks, but in this podcast I found out that it's realistic. I mean, there is no hogwash or shortcuts or mumbo jumbo, pop psychology, motivational talk. No. Straight, no nonsense podcast with all the latest research, and people who come there, they are really psychologists, studied, qualified. It's a great podcast to go with. So guys, these are the 5 podcasts will definitely help you to be a better communicator, to speak confidently and without studying grammar. Hope you liked it. Bye.